All right, so picking up from where we left off last week, we're going to finish up with prosody coverage and then move on to dysarthrias in the second part of class. Last thing we talked about was fMRI studies that involve perceiving prosodic messages, and this figure kind of summarizes the results of those studies, which show that perceiving, the red ones are emotional or affective prosody studies, so perceiving whether somebody is angry or sad or whatever, and the green are linguistic prosody. And the kind of take-home message is basically it's language areas that seem to be mostly involved: the inferior frontal gyrus, the superior temporal gyrus, and also some kind of general processing areas that pop up in a lot of studies, such as inferior parietal sulcus and pre-SMA. So that's perceiving prosody. That doesn't necessarily mean those regions are also involved in producing prosody, but there have been only 3 studies. Yes, that have looked at this, and linguistic prosody has been looked at in the most studies, basically. And emphatic stress is the main thing. So these studies basically contrast something like Bob bought the car with Bob bought the car, or something where there's an emphasized word or stressed word in the utterance, contrasted with when there's no stressed word in the same utterance. And here what you see depends on the study, but left and right ventral premotor cortex have been identified, and these are areas around what I have told you not to call the larynx motor area, but that spot there on both sides, the supplementary motor area, and the inferior frontal gyrus. And laterality has been a little mixed on this particular finding. There was more recent finding from ECOG, Eddie Chang's lab, that basically identified this same right ventral premotor cortex as being more heavily involved than the left, but the left has shown up as well in other studies. So premotor cortex, supplementary motor area, we're familiar with those largely. Now, a slightly different thing to do is to control the intonation pattern in the sense of whether something is a question or a neutral thing or a statement. And so this involves whether the pitch goes up at the end, and it's a very super segmental thing, not a localized thing. And this has been associated with cortical activity in left inferior frontal gyrus. And the left here might be a little surprising because, as we'll see at the end of the prosody coverage, right inferior frontal gyrus damage seems to have more of an effect on the intonation pattern than left. But again, with fMRI, well, any technology for that matter, but especially fMRI, circa 2002, say there maybe the right was just threshold, and so laterality, given that there's so few studies, is not really all that clear from this fMRI literature yet. Ventral premotor cortex was bilateral activity. You see right hemisphere in the ACC and the pre-SMA for control of intonation pattern as well. Note that there's VPMC and IFG are showing up in both of these, and SMA/pre-SMA. So there's a little bit of correspondence between the areas involved in emphatic stress and the areas involved in intonation pattern. There are also studies that have shown some subcortical activity, especially in the right cerebellum, quite possibly hooked up with left frontal cortical areas like the IFG, but also right putamen. Now, so given those 2 findings, can we say anything about maybe which hemisphere of cortex is more involved, just based on those subcortical findings? Or So for the cerebellum, it would suggest left, but for the putamen, it's on the same side as cortex. So actually, it doesn't really give you much information. So right putamen is associated with right cortex, right cerebellum is associated with the left cortex. So one thing to keep in mind, and we'll kind of unpack this a bit as we look at the lesion literature on prosodic cues, is that these studies are conflating two aspects of prosodic control that may involve different hemispheres for control. And we'll be talking a lot about hemisphere models shortly, and intonation is something that's often talked about right hemisphere being the main controller, but metrical timing actually, and exactly where the stress occurs, those sorts of things may be more left hemisphere controlled, and this may be why you see kind of a murky picture regarding which cortical hemisphere is involved in generating these messages, because in fact, they both might be involved, they both might be doing different aspects of the problem. Okay, also I teased that there are a few studies looking at affective prosodic messages, but I think these are more interesting as curiosities rather than informative pieces of science. And the reason for that being that they just ask people to act happy, sad, and angry when they're answering questions. There's no real control over that. So in fact, people are acting rather than being happy, sad, or angry. Nonetheless, people have done such studies, and this first study, Meyer et al. Noted right lateralized IFG activity for these emotive conditions. And that makes some sense if you think of right hemispheres being involved in affect. However, another study by Azizeta et al. Found pre-SMA, ACC, the left PIFG, and left VPMC for the exact same sort of thing. There may be one, I think one of these didn't have all three of the conditions, they only had two, but basically a non-overlapping set of brain areas were found in the second one, although IFG does at least show up in both cases, just not in the same hemisphere.
To what extent does acting a certain way over a long period of time make you actually feel that way? So actually sort of circularly giving.
That would be a nice question to know before you run out an entire experiment to look at it. And I don't think anybody knows the answer to that. I mean, you can point to like method actors, and presumably they're actually somehow getting themselves to totally be in that state. Sure, that'd be fantastic.
I was thinking more like facial feedback.
Yeah, even that, I mean, I'm sure to some degree you can affect people's mood over time. I don't think you can do it terribly reliably over 45 minutes of an fMRI study.
45 minutes for all three.
Well, I'm assuming, I mean, we don't know, we try not to go beyond 45 minutes for all of the tests combined in an fMRI study because people get antsy.
Maybe, but probably not this.
Right, so it could be up to an hour maybe max, but in any case, I doubt that. I mean, there may be some, but that acts to further cloud the results rather than to determine, because we have no idea how much of that really happened here. And the other thing about that is presumably the earliest trials, they'd be acting, and then the later trials, they wouldn't. So that would
also, if it's counterbalanced, you're probably not going to get super into one emotion.
Right, exactly. Yep. Pichon and Kell did another study of this sort. They found peaks in IFG, superior temporal gyrus. Oop, that wasn't before, brand new, cerebellum, basal ganglia, and thalamus. So all the speech network and language network areas pop up here, but not at all consistently across the studies, and very likely because of the fact that acting like you are happy or sad is not the same. And so, according to the view that I've espoused so far, what do you think might be going on here? So these are primarily cortical areas they're talking about. Where have we suggested that affect might affect your speech output? So some limbic pathway that goes to the PAG, the periaqueductal gray, and then onto the brainstem. Maybe the cingulate definitely projects there, and it is involved here. But I think the point I'm trying to make here is, I know I'm trying to make here actually, and it is that that's a fully subcortical route that is subconscious. Like you're not thinking about doing that, and when you are angry, you're not thinking about sounding angry generally. You're just angry, and that affects your voice. These studies, they are thinking about it. Their cortex has to be trying to be happy or sad or whatever under these different conditions, and this may explain why you see this preponderance of cortical areas involved, when in fact it might just be a relatively low-level subcortical effect where limbic structures can affect the brainstem output paths. Okay, well, if you summarize the generation of prosodic messages, I would say the green ones here make the most sense, but it turns out the red ones aren't all that far off other than the STG here. Green ones are the linguistic prosody cases. And what you see is you get the IFG and ventral premotor cortex, so these kind of motor planning areas, pre-SMA, at least in one hemisphere, depending on the task, and that we've talked about involved in sequencing and working memory for speech, and anterior cingulate cortex, which we haven't really talked about as a language area. So this may be an aspect of language where the ACC plays a bigger role than people classically consider when thinking of language areas of the brain. All right. The last thing we'll talk about regarding prosody then is hemispheric laterality of prosodic processing. And there's a long literature on this, primarily from lesion literature, so people with strokes who have language aphasia issues, and experiments generally, certainly long ago and still mostly to this day, focus just on, is it left hemisphere damage or right hemisphere damage? They don't say, is it pre-SMA versus ventral premotor cortex or anything like that, left or right hemisphere damage. And so the models reflect that. The models describe differences in processing in left and right hemisphere, and that's the depth to which they go for addressing these things. So I'm going to talk about several different models here. And the details are different, but in fact, a lot of what they're saying across these models is similar. And I'll summarize that, and then we'll look at those summary points, kind of covering all the models simultaneously. The first of the models was Federici and Alter, and in this model, they suggest, and these are language people, they suggest that the left hemisphere is mostly important for syntactic and semantic information, so, kind of key linguistic aspects of language, whereas the right hemisphere, in their view, is primarily sentence-level prosody, so the intonation, the slowly varying intonation profile. The second model by Sittis and Van Lanker-Sittis suggests that the differences have to do with acoustic processing, and this basic idea is going to pop up in multiple models. And in this Sittis view, the left hemisphere is specialized for timing or rate of things, whereas the right hemisphere is specialized for pitch processing or maybe more generally spectral processing, so the frequency content of the message. The third variant that I'll talk about is closely related to this. And this variant says that the left hemisphere analyzes sounds using a very short temporal window, meaning that it can capture very rapid changes in sounds or generate very rapid differences in timing, but in auditory cortex, it's a matter of perceiving the timing. While the right hemisphere is looking at a longer temporal window. This turns out a longer temporal window allows you, so that gives you better spectral resolution, but poorer temporal resolution. So this actually sounds a lot like the Sidtis and Van Lancker-Sidtis view, which is timing on the left, rapid timing especially, spectral stuff more on the right. So the Popel view is that there are different temporal windows, left and right, and there's some evidence for this, although where if you look at the preferred temporal window, there's a large amount of overlap between left and right. It's just that the right has a bit more of the longer window and the left has a bit more of the shorter window, but they both have both. And then Zatori and colleagues have suggested, again, that the right is, rather than saying longer temporal window, they are saying more or less the same thing by basically saying it's spectral processing. So these last three are all very kind of similar, that left is doing timing, probably rapid timing things, right is probably doing more spectral and slower varying spectral things. And then the only variation is that the Federici model says that left hemisphere is the languagey part, which almost everyone kind of believes already. So let's see how well these hold up. So the common themes across them are that the right hemisphere preference is for pitch and intonation sort of things. Left hemisphere for segmental and lexical information. Segmental, this being more from the first model we talked about. And the third being that the left hemisphere is also more for rapid timing information. Now let's take a look at where those all came from, because they come from a similar set of findings. The first is that the right hemisphere preference is for pitch and intonation. The lesion literature shows that people with right hemisphere damage are more impaired in perceptual processing of pitch, and as well as the production of intonation patterns. So that fits quite well with the idea that the right is more involved in pitch and intonation. In terms of perception, Zatori has shown that people with left temporal lobectomy, meaning that their temporal lobe is gone in the left hemisphere, and comparing them to the right temporal lobe patients, in a pitch perception task with complex tones, the impairment was for the right hemisphere damage patients only. This task is something like this, where if I give you a complex of tones, like 100 hertz and all of its harmonics, 200, 400, etc., and I remove the 100 hertz one, you still hear 100 hertz as the pitch if I'm playing that to both ears. These studies take that a step further and they play half of the harmonics on one side, half on the other, but nowhere is the fundamental played. In that situation, and keep in mind that, of course, the temporal lobe is gone on one side. So one of the effects is going to be that you're not hearing very well one side of this. That said, the biggest impairments, the only group that was really severely impaired was the right hemisphere damage group. Why might hearing be reasonably preserved for this sort of thing in the, so let's say your left hemisphere is removed, left temporal lobe, so all of your left auditory cortex is removed. Why is it that you can still hear tones that are presented to your right ear and you do this task? Nope. Because in auditory cortex, unlike some other parts of cortex, there's actually quite a lot of bilateral stuff going on from the subcortical to the cortical structure. So the right hemisphere gets both right and left ear information, even though it gets mostly left ear information, it does get both. And so there's enough of residual hearing for them to tell the complex tones, unless it's their right hemisphere auditory cortex that's messed up. suggesting that our right hemisphere auditory cortex is crucial for this tone, this pitch task. Another study comes from Sintis and Volpe, and they found that right hemisphere stroke patients, well, this is basically the same finding, complex pitch perception task. But the additional finding here is that left hemisphere patients were impaired on a speech perception task that involved understanding what was being said, the words that are being said. So language on the left, prosody or pitch on the right. It's better, pitch on the right is a better way to say it than prosody on the right, for reasons that have become more clear. Emotional prosody also appears to be more affected by right hemisphere damage. However, the impairment appears to be mostly, so emotional prosody has two kinds of cues. There are the voice quality cues that I've said may be these things that are caused by PAG affecting subcortical processing consciously. Let me reconstruct this. Right, so there are two aspects of the other aspect. So right hemisphere is specific to the part that involves pitch modulation. So emotional prosody has exaggerated pitch oftentimes compared to, like if you're emotional, the way you use intonation changes as well as your voice quality. Those intonation-based changes are the ones that are impaired. The ability to tell them is impaired in right hemisphere damage. So it's not the temporal cues of voice quality that is impaired in the right hemisphere patients. It's the pitch-based cues. So this again highlights that both emotional and linguistic prosody have two different kinds of cues, timing versus spectral, and that these cues may be processed by different hemispheres. Exactly. All right. Now, in terms of looking at so that was all perception of prosody. When producing prosody, what you see is that if you have right hemisphere damage, you will often have less overall variation of F0 or pitch. So you're basically speaking with a flat affect, more or less, compared to people who have left hemisphere damage. And you're also less able to convey emphasis, which is a linguistic thing, but still seems right lateralized in this case, maybe because of the intonation profile component of it, probably. And then also they generally use so in addition to losing the F0 variation part of affective information, they seem to lose other things about emotion in their voices. So again, there's some right hemisphere preference, but it's unclear if it's entirely related to affective prosody or if it's more related to particular cues within affective prosody. In the next study, Van Lanker, Sintis, and colleagues identified a patient who lost the ability to, lost the ability to mimic other dialects and sing, which is kind of a strange thing, but otherwise language was in good shape. And this patient had a right hemisphere basal ganglia lesion. So again, right hemisphere, this time in particular the basal ganglia, but interestingly limited to things that involve, well, singing of course involves following an external intonation profile and being able to generate that profile yourself when there's no music playing. But mimicking others is kind of an odd thing where anytime, so if you're speaking, another view of left hemisphere is you're reading out stuff from memory as opposed to adjusting stuff based on circumstances. Feedback control might be one of those circumstances where you might adjust stuff in the right hemisphere, but also something like mimicking somebody else may require you to use the right hemisphere to kind of modulate left hemisphere motor programs. And this findings kind of suggests that. So in that case, it wouldn't be so much prosody that you're unable to do, it's unable to adjust what the motor programs are doing volitionally, at least. Okay, another study by Peters looked at dysprosody of intonation profile. And this was a study that, interestingly, didn't involve stroke patients. It involved epileptic patients. And if what they noticed over many years of having patients with seizures is that if they're talking during a seizure, that the intonation is disrupted only if the seizure is in the right hemisphere, but according to them, never if it's in the left hemisphere. That would seem to be a fairly strong piece of evidence that right hemisphere is involved in that intonation profile generation more than the left hemisphere is involved in intonation profile generation. Whenever anybody says never, I get a little worried. The other thing is that I think what they probably are implying is language dominant versus non-dominant. Rather than left versus right. But as far as this class is concerned, we will always assume everybody is left
language dominant. How often
on
do
the
people
exam.
in a research setting talk during seizures? Like, how did they get this data?
Well, so the people that go in for seizures usually have lots and lots of seizures, and not all seizures involve losing complete control of your motor control. So for example, temporal lobe epilepsy is more like you get kind of dream-like states and things happen more perceptually rather than production-wise. And so it's for many kinds of seizures, you can in fact speak, and they're in the hospital to be observed because of their seizures. So they're talking to their doctors a lot during seizures, I believe, just saying what's happening if they can. But I think these
seems already like a subset of the subset.
Yeah, but if you do 40 surgeries a year or more, then you do it for 10 years. There's a whole lot of people that spoke during their seizures. I don't know how long these people did this, but it's not.
We noticed this is supposed to okay,
right.
This wasn't quick. Did this repetition suppression test.
It was. My recollection is that it was not that tightly controlled. They did not in advance say we're going to do an experiment where they're going to talk during the seizure. Just as an observation. All right, and finally, in a fMRI study from the year 2000, back when fMRI was the Wild West, and people were still figuring out how to use it effectively. Rika and colleagues found that if you have somebody reproduce a non-lyrical tune, so humming a song that had no words, like not national, the German, I forgot what song this was. Anyway, it was a song that everybody was familiar with, but didn't have words, and they all were asked to reproduce it. In this case, I believe they were doing it overtly. They did another study where it was covert, but that versus speaking is what they were looking at. And in this early study, they claimed to find only right hemisphere activity in motor cortex during the tone reproduction, and only left hemisphere activity during the speech. We know now, without a doubt, that there is in fact right hemisphere activity during speech as well. So this study must have been severely underpowered back then to not find right hemisphere activity. But I think the main point that the study is making has been borne out in a couple of additional studies of singing in particular, that singing involves more right hemisphere than speaking, basically. So when people sing, you don't really see any decrease in activity in the left, if it's at least there are words in the songs, but you see more activity in the right. That's generally the change that you see when you look at studies of singing. So it's more bilateral and rather than left lateralized. but it's not that the left decreases, which would be implied by this study. It's that the left stays pretty much the same and the right increases. And my guess is that this was more a matter of having very poor power back in those days when doing an fMRI.
Is that even in non-lyrical speech, the left stays pretty much the same and the right increases?
Non-lyrical speech?
Yeah, sorry, the non-lyrical.
Tune.
Non-lyrical
Like, almost
singing.
all speech is non-lyrical.
Non-lyrical.
That my guess is that they're going doo, 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 like that, then yes, indeed, you'll see both hemispheres. But I do not know 100% for sure. But most of the studies I'm familiar with that show what I talked about with more right and the same left were indeed singing with words. So it's possible that that would be different. Okay. Oh, here it is, singing. So singing, as we know, that's a kind of relatively slowly varying intonation profile. That in fMRI studies shows, as I mentioned, and will pop up in one of these bullet points later, not the one I was thinking it was, that the right hemisphere is more active. Another interesting finding, and this is often discussed with regard to aphasics in particular, but has seemed to pop up in other populations, is that many populations can sing things better than they can speak them, at least if they were like already known things. So singing a well-known song is not usually a problem for a left hemisphere patient, but if you ask them to say the words of that song without singing it, then it is a problem for them. Yeah, whether that would be true and actually there's a therapy based on the idea that maybe that generalizes to if they just sing everything, even new stuff, not just a song that they already knew. And that's gone through various names. Melodic intonation therapy was one name for it. Now Gottfried Schlaug is one of the authors up there, has what he calls auditory motor mapping training, which combines both singing and playing drums, trying to engage people more. And with those therapies, to some degree, you can improve speech output of people with aphasia, as well as kids with, like minimally verbal kids with autism. Yes, you can change some, but it isn't like they can just start singing everything they want to say from then on and they're fine. There's a tiny bit of improvement in the number of words that they're able to say after intensive therapy. So hasn't yet proven, I don't think, to be a really super effective therapy for overcoming these sorts of deficits, but at least it does tell us something about brain function and does provide at least a little bit of improvement. And just as a kind of an aside about that kind of thing, people whose kids have nonverbal, minimally verbal autism, if you can get them to say 2 words more than they say, it is overwhelmingly satisfying to those parents. Even though it has little practical impact, it can have a huge psychological impact. And it's pretty striking when you see, like if you see that in person where, the kid's doing something, still highly, highly impaired, but at least it's a little better. And that, something could be said for that being worth it, even if it doesn't improve the communication capabilities much of the child. And a lot of this is that way. If you're an adult and you got a stroke in your left hemisphere, you're probably not gonna, if it's in your inferior frontal gyrus and stuff, you're probably not gonna speak normally again, but your quality of life can be improved in various ways. And don't underestimate the placebo-ish power of just a little bit of improvement in these cases compared to no improvement at all, which is what they've seen, the entire time the person has been disordered. So
what does singing look like in Parkinson's? Because you think if it had a tune, it would keep, make it more of a continuous mode.
That's a good question. I do not know the answer to it.
I don't fully know either, but I know that there are a bunch of singing therapies that are being studied and requires but a lot of that is to do with, I know the
A lot of
choir,
it's like vocal control.
Yeah, it's
Right.
like breathing
But-
louder.
yeah, but it's also like, because you're, so right, you have people beside you, so who will cue,
Yeah.
that's kind of like the cueing
Yeah.
effects.
But
Yeah.
I mean, but saying like the same words, would it be easier if you
Oh.
had it to a tune, instead of like.
I think if they sing it loudly, my guess is yes. If they
Yeah.
just sing it normally, I don't know.
Or kind of like how, we often see this commonality between PD and stuttering, that you ask them to say something in a novel way, then probably for that
That might help
utterance
for
or
a few
time.
minutes. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
right.
I was
But-
just thinking because singing is more continuous.
Yeah, I'm not. I'm sure there's some literature on that, but I'm not familiar with it. But I can say that it's unlikely that it's dramatically improving because I would have heard of that. Most likely. Okay. If we look at neural, okay, there's what I was saying before. I've already said this twice now. Stronger response in the right, but not a decrease in the left. Speech areas for singing versus speaking in neurologically normal individuals. In particular, seeing the IFG and the the somatosensory motor cortex, so pre and post central gyri, and auditory cortical areas, which are the key, all of the cortical areas for speech, pretty much. Okay, the last little thing was left hemisphere preference for segmental or lexical information. To some degree, this is in those timing models a little bit, not entirely, but in that segmental information is more rapidly varying usually than other intonation profiles. Let's see. So differences in word meaning, for example, you're raising pitch, that kind of lexical stress generally is associated with damage to the left hemisphere, although we earlier heard that if you look at ECOG and fMRI, some people seem to see it in the right and not the left hemisphere. So again, mixed about hemisphere, but in this study at least, it seemed as though generation of this lexical stress really required left hemisphere damage. Oh, actually, I'm a little bit wrong here. There are I'm conflating two things. So lexical stress is when the stress pattern is built into the word. So offense versus offense, that's built into the word. That's not like the global intonation pattern. That is what this left hemisphere damage seemed to show. The right hemisphere stuff we saw was emphatic stress, where within a sentence you emphasize a word. So that's more of like a global super segmental thing, as opposed to this lexical stress, which in my interpretation is more like that's built into the motor programs, and it's not surprising that that is more left lateralized. Similarly, another cue that could be either super segmental or segmental, lexical pitch. We don't have lexical pitch in English, but in languages that do, that's basically that if you like do an upward tone pattern, it means something different than you do a downward tone pattern, and then it's a completely different word, not just a change in the global meaning of the sentence. Those also appear to be more left lateralized. So this lexical pitch is a case where the slowly varying idea comes into conflict with the left for language lexical idea, and left for language lexical wins in this case, in that the lexical pitch appears at least to be more left lateralized, as though it were a speech motor program for language, a meaning thing, whereas it may be more right lateralized if it's a prosodic contour adjustment. Yeah, okay. So, yeah, I thought that was the final thing. This is definitely the final thing. Left hemisphere preference for timing information. Many of the models have some version of this, and especially when you consider rapid timing. So if you consider like slowly varying timing of the prosodic contour, that's not so clear cut. But if it's a very rapid timing thing, then left hemisphere is usually where you would expect that to be happening. And the one issue with this is that almost, if you look at a motor disorder, any speech motor disorder, almost everyone impacts some aspect of prosody. And that's because if you can't read the words out properly, your prosody is not going to be normal. Basically, there's going to be, breaks and pauses and so forth. And a lot of times that's just reported as impaired prosody. That's kind of like too rough a grain to really get a lot from that. So anything that impacts P4 motor programs, for example, will impact prosody. So it's difficult to break apart things that impact prosody from damage to things that are generating that metrical structure. And this is kind of related to earlier when we were talking about the motor control of prosodic cues is basically the same as segmental. It's the same cortical and subcortical areas we've been talking about. But the generation of those linguistically meaningful prosodic cues is higher level language areas. And so damage to any part of the key control components of speech will impair the metrical structure, because you'll just not be able to read the motor programs out effectively. And there are all kinds of ways that'll pop up, and we'll, in the next part of the class, we'll look at some specific examples of that. Also, anything that damages your ability to generate a long utterance, like a multi-word sentence or phrase, like Brokaw's aphasia, that will dramatically impair prosody, even if Brokaw's area is not the one that's controlling the prosodic contour. The problem is that you're just not generating the words fluidly enough to generate a meaningful prosodic contour. So it's tough to tell from damage to prosody it's tough to tell much about which brain areas are most involved. However, people have looked at perceiving prosody, and that problem goes away to a large degree, perceiving timing information. And one of the frequent findings regarding perceiving that is that left hemisphere patients do have larger deficits in perceiving timing cues. That's some suggestive evidence that maybe they'll have problems generating it. There is some evidence also of generating prosodic cues. And one of the studies that suggests this is by Van Lanker and Sidtis. Here they had people doing, perceiving prosodic cues. And what they found, and we touched on this before, is that if the prosodic cues were in the pitch profile, then right hemisphere damage patients were more impaired. But if it was in the temporal profile, then it was the left hemisphere patients who were more impaired. So again, suggesting that the different components, the temporal versus spectral components of prosody, are preferentially treated by different hemispheres.
How can you tell if it was impaired?
Their ability to detect these things, they would give them example sentences where the metrical structure was all that was changed, and that changed the affective or prosodic, like the meaning of the sentence, and are they able to detect that or not, versus when they changed finer grained temporal cues. I can't remember what the temporal cues in this particular study were, but basically by having controlled sentences where only F0 was changing or only the metrical structure was changing. And, of course, that we can emphasize by increasing duration. That would be more difficult for a left hemisphere patient to detect than if we did it with increased pitch profile. And the opposite is true for the right hemisphere patients. All right, and then the last study by Willett and Baum found that left hemisphere damage patients were impaired in their use of temporal cues to mark emphatic stress. So again, if they were emphasizing, they wouldn't use duration so much to change it, they would use pitch changes to change prosody. So this is one of the few studies that kind of gets at production mechanisms where they're not impaired overall in production, they just use different cues in their production, and that matches up again with the idea that the left hemisphere is more the durational or timing related components, right hemisphere more pitch contour components. Right. Also, same thing for left hemisphere damage. Generating global stress patterns that conform to the norms of the language, so meaningful stress patterns. In this case, they found a deficit in left hemisphere damage patients. And this stress thing, that's that same emphatic stress thing where right hemisphere was implied before by some of the studies. So I would say this is still pretty open whether that is going to, if that would generalize. A lot of these studies don't have very big subject group sizes also. Okay, that's it for prosody. Why don't we take a break now, and then I'll set up, and then we'll get through hopefully most of the. We're on to the last chapter, and the first half of that chapter is basically on the dysarthrias, and that's what we'll cover today. So first, for the next 2 weeks, basically the goal, or well, 2 lectures, the goal is to use, it's not so much to describe these in great detail, but these disorders, but to interpret them with regard to the DIVA and GoDIVA models. So basically to use what we've learned about the model over the course of the semester to now go back and interpret all of these disorders of speech production explicitly in terms of what would be happening in the models. And before we get started, this consideration is important, and it's something very similar to what we just talked about with prosody, that the severity of the effects of neural damage on speech output depends on what gets damaged. And if the feed-forward system is damaged, then you're going to see problems. But other systems could be damaged and not necessarily cause a lot of problems. So for example, in a fully grown adult who knows the language very well, if they go deaf, for example, and lose auditory feedback control, their speech is actually still quite intelligible, very intelligible, in fact, for decades, often after deafness. There are a few cues, what we call the postural parameters that change. So the voice loudness and intonation are a little bit different, but still very intelligible. And actually what you can damage depends on what developmental stage you're at. So when would it be bad to lose auditory feedback control?
Pre-lingually.
Pre-lingually would be disastrous, in fact. And so people who are born deaf, very, very, very rare cases do they learn speech, intelligible speech, or at least reasonably intelligible speech. They often be taught to say a few words and do some speech, but that's a very, very bad time to not have auditory feedback control. But we just learned that in the adult, it's no big deal. What about somatosensory feedback control? That's a little tougher. There are very few cases of people without it, but I mean, when would it be worse to lose it? Prelingually, again, because feedback, again, it's helping shape the motor programs and everything. And so again, early on, it would be probably a lot worse to lose that. So feedback control mechanisms, generally speaking, are bad in childhood, but maybe not so bad as an adult. What about feed-forward mechanisms?
Worse as an adult. You already have it.
It's always bad though, because even as a kid, your speech is largely under feed-forward control in the sense that you may not have 2 feed-forward commands, but you're not relying on sensory feedback to adjust online because that takes too long. You're reading out something, and that's something, if that's impaired, no matter what age you are, that's going to be disastrous for your speech. So one thing that we can kind of take home from the model right away is anything that affects the feed-forward control system is going to be very bad for speech at all stages, whereas feedback control things may not be that big a deal for adults. They may mainly be problems for children.
if you're young enough, can you redevelop feed-forward through different pathways?
Well, so, I mean, some degree. So, for example, if your cerebellum is damaged, yeah, probably if it happens early enough, and there are disorders where the cerebellum degrades very relatively, like when you're 10, then in that case, probably your cortex can take on more of the job. But if you lose motor cortex bilaterally, no, so to some degree, yes, and almost always the earlier some sort of brain damage happens in your development, the better your prognosis for recovering from it. And that is certainly heavily true of language at the language level, less true of motor control, where at the motor control levels, most of the things on either side will cause some problems, but in a lot of cases, the other side can compensate. Where would that not be the case? What kind of damage would be? There's no other place to take it over. Possibly basic ganglia, other hemispheres at least interconnected with it. What parts are not interconnected and are only unilateral? Cranial nerves. So if you have damage to your left cranial, like if you lose all your left cranial motor neurons, then you will be permanently paralyzed on the left side of your right side of your body, of your vocal tract. So anything that above, like at cortex level, there's callosal connections for everything. Pretty much every part on the left is connected to that same part on the right. And so there's some chance at least for getting better. And if you just have unilateral motor cortex damage, for example, it's usually not that bad, the impairment. It's bilateral that really causes trouble. And so usually you see that not so much in stroke, but in ALS and diseases that involve bilateral degeneration of the neurons, so the myelinization. All right. Okay, so dysarthria is separated from other types of disorders of speech by the following characteristics. The main one so the main three types of speech disorders, well, some of the main ones, the dysarthrias are kind of more motoric. Apraxia of speech is like a motor program level where the motor neurons are fine, the muscles are fine, it's something higher level that's impaired. And then aphasia is the third class, and those are language impairments, not speech motor control, but higher level language impairments. There's some overlap between apraxia of speech and aphasia. In fact, many Broca's aphasias have apraxia of speech, but the disorders are still somewhat distinguished. Stuttering doesn't really fall into that, and we're going to treat stuttering next week. That's sometimes called a fluency disorder that's differentiated from dysarthria or apraxia. But strangely enough, for decades in the literature, stuttering was almost thought of as not a speech motor disorder, which makes no sense and has been rectified. Okay, so dysarthria is then weakness or abnormal muscle tone of the speech musculature is the key thing that separates it from the other disorders that I just mentioned, because all of those are higher level planning or motor program readout areas, whereas dysarthrias are relatively low level areas. And so often it's not just speech that's impaired, but other kinds of movements of the articulators, breathing can be impaired also, and phonation. All of these are impaired not just for speech, but usually also for other tasks that involve the vocal tract articulators. And the main, kind of behavioral signature would be slurred or slow or effortful speech that's prosodically abnormal, but as we just described, there are many different ways that the prosody can be impaired, and we'll see a range of those. Often you will also, usually you'll see a diminished amplitude and velocity of speech movements. That doesn't mean that the speech necessarily slows down in terms of number of phonemes per second. It means that the movements aren't as far. So one kind of dysarthria that we'll talk about is hypokinetic dysarthria. In that, the speech can actually speed up in the sense that the speaker does more phonemes in a shorter period of time, but the movements for those phonemes are slower or not, or they're incomplete. They're not held out to their full extent. So that would be a diminished amplitude of speech. But generally, one of those things is happening. Amplitude and velocity is impaired, slowed down. And as I mentioned, they're distinct from the apraxia of speech and aphasia disorders by apraxia of speech being a motor programming disorder with normal muscle tone and preserved articulatory movement abilities. So a person with apraxia of speech usually can stick out their tongue and push their tongue to the roof of their mouth as hard as anybody else and move their tongue quickly, just not when they're trying to say certain speech motor programs. So it's not a muscle motor neuron related thing, it's a higher level thing. And then aphasias are even a stage higher up from that, where they're language related, not just speech output related. Okay, there are a bunch of different subtypes that we're going to go through. Some of them the model doesn't have a whole lot to say about. So for example, flaccid dysarthria, that's when the cranial nerves and associated nuclei in the brainstem are damaged. You may recall these are sometimes called lower motor neurons. That basically causes paralysis on the opposite side of the damage of the neurons. Spastic dysarthria is what happens with motor cortex damage. Ataxic dysarthria is with cerebellum damage. I'm going to go through all these in more detail, so I'm just quickly overviewing them. Hypokinetic dysarthria is typically due to Parkinson's disease, so mainly a basal ganglia issue. Hyperkinetic dysarthria, which in some ways is kind of opposite, also due to lesions or diseases of the basal ganglia. It should no longer be surprising to you that opposite effects can happen in basal ganglia. And now what we're going to do is just go through where those things fall into this DIVA schematic and what the implications are for where they are. So the first that we're going to cover is flaccid dysarthria. So flaccid dysarthria, that's when the output motor neurons are damaged. That's the final common pathway. So both the feed-forward and the feedback systems will be impaired because both of them have to run through that those motor neurons to get to the periphery, and they're not bilateral, these connections. So if one side is damaged, you'll be paralyzed on that side. If both sides are damaged, you're finished, basically. You're unable to speak, or at least unable to move some of the articulators. Okay, flaccid dysarthria is characterized by weakness of the afflicted muscles, which makes sense. They're not getting motor neuron input. Of course, because the motor neurons are specific to different articulators, the affected articulators will depend on which cranial nuclei are damaged. For example, if the trigeminal nucleus were damaged, what would you expect, which articulation would you expect to be most damaged? Jaw movements, because that's the one that controls jaw movements. How about which one would most affect tongue movements? Hypoglossy. Somebody knows their cranial. Okay, so flaccid dysarthria can be caused by a brainstem stroke, and there are also, and this is true of most of the disorders we'll talk about, there are multiple things that can cause most of these. So stroke is common across many of these, but not all of them. Other things like neuromuscular junction diseases like myasthenia gravis, demyelination diseases, Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is basically damage to the output pathways. Again, the myelin affects the synaptic transmission in those. A muscular disorder can actually lead to this as well, so muscular dystrophy. and motor neuron diseases like ALS and progressive bulbar palsy. ALS involves motor cortex on down. Sometimes it's neurons in the motor cortex, sometimes it's projections down, but in both of these cases for flaccid dysarthria, the problem is that you're not able to activate properly the cranial nerves that are controlling the muscles. Unilateral damage tends to produce mild impairments, partly because a lot of speech can be done with one side of the mouth. Bilateral damage is much more devastating and permanent, basically. As far as I know, the only way to address something like that would be some sort of nerve bypass, and I don't believe there's technology for that yet that can do this. Here's an example of flaccid dysarthria from Duffy, Joe Duffy, who's one of the top names in communication or speech disorders, speech motor disorders. Oh, let me.
Well, he is nearly 93 years old.
Hang on.
Well, he is nearly 93 years old.
Is it? Yeah.
Well, he is nearly 93 years old, yet he still thinks as swiftly as ever. He dresses himself.
One thing to note, I keep trying to pause it, but this isn't working, is you'll notice a degradation over time because he gets weaker and weaker and weaker as he continues speaking in this case.
Well, he is nearly 93 years old, yet he still thinks as swiftly as ever. He dresses himself in an old black frock coat, usually several buttons missing. A round beard clings to his chin, giving those who hear him a pronounced feeling of the utmost respect. Twice each day, he plays skillfully and with zest upon a small organ. Except in the winter when the snow or ice prevents, he slowly takes a short walk in the open garden day.
So, Greg, you know, more and more,
him to walk more and
if you kind of imagine yourself
but he always
like already being almost too tired to do something and then having to keep doing it, this is kind of what it seems like in this case. And so I think these images, I didn't put these in there, I think Rosemary, Lester Smith put them in there, but the asymmetries are, I think, what's being noted in here, where it's semi-paralyzed on one part of it, one side, and not the other. Okay, so that's it. That's the most output-oriented part. The next step up would be at the motor cortex, and spastic dysarthria is what happens from bilateral damage to motor cortex. As I mentioned, unilateral damage isn't that bad because motor cortical neurons do project to both sides. It's just when you get down to the very final output, that it becomes unilateral again. But bilateral damage has sometimes devastating effects. And it's important to note that the motor cortex does a couple of things. We normally have been thinking about it as activating muscles, but it also modulates things. And if you take away motor input, you can actually cause hyperactivity of other muscles, of some muscles. So there's a mix actually of hyper and hypoactive muscle activity. And this leads to things like strained voice quality, a slowed speaking rate, possibly to just make the speech more intelligible, partly. Restricted pitch and loudness variability. Often it's caused by stroke, but that needs to be bilateral. So actually, more often it's something like ALS, or there are inflammatory diseases that also affect myelin. Leukoencephalitis is one of those. And those basically impair either the neurons themselves in motor cortex or their projections down to subcortical structures. And as I mentioned, there's a combination of hypoactivity, which is because you're not activating muscles enough, but also you're reducing the amount of modulation of So for example, some cortical cells go down and impact inhibitory neurons, and if you take that input away, you're going to take away the inhibition and have too much activity as well. So it basically leads to very poor muscle coordination and movement capabilities. So for example, given where this is, which of the control systems should it impact? If any. That was just a red herring. That's great. Which of the main control subsystems should be impacted by damage to the primary motor cortex? Yeah. Feed forward. Okay. Feedback. That's all of them. Yes. The reason is that both of those systems converge on primary motor cortex according to the model. And so if you damage primary motor cortex, much like damaging the periphery, you're impacting both systems simultaneously. The bigger problem is normally going to be the feed-forward system, especially since most of these diseases are late in life diseases rather than developmental diseases. And so it's the damage to the feed-forward system that is the main problem in terms of intelligibility, but both of the systems should be severely impacted because the neurons that they're trying to use to manipulate the vocal tract are not working properly. Okay, so not only would that apply to both feed-forward and feedback control, but it also applies not just to motor execution, but motor learning. And motor cortex is heavily involved in the motor learning process. Projections to motor cortex are the ones that, for example, might be involved in learning sensory motor transformations from the sensory error feedback in the feedback control systems. And if the motor cortex is impaired, not only will you impair performance now, but you will also presumably greatly impair the ability to affect movements. Could the cerebellum save you here? How does the cerebellum, what's the main pathway by which it affects movement? Where's the output of the cerebellum go? Eventually, yes. And so if cerebellum goes to motor cortex in order to have its effect, if motor cortex is damaged, then the cerebellum really can't help you there because it's trying to act through those same motor cortical neurons that are damaged. And so in this case, there's probably no good way, again, to overcome the damage because all of your pathways are depending on those, all of your voluntary movement pathways at least are depending on those motor cortical neurons to allow them to reach the speech articulators. Okay, here are some examples of speech by people with ALS.
One, two, three, four, five.
So hugely effortful for starters, probably because anytime that muscles are activated, some of them are being overactivated, and some of the ones you want are being underactivated. So the voice is strained.
One more time.
So extremely strained and effortful, I think, is the best way to describe that. And that, again, with output pathway damage, there's not a lot that you can do about that. And so, again, these are very, if the damage is widespread, very, very bad communication disorders issues. The next one, ataxic dysarthria, involves the cerebellum. And usually the cerebellum, not always. It can also occur with damage to the ventrolateral nucleus of the thalamus, and why would that be?
Because the cerebellum goes back.
That's how it gets to cortex, is through the ventrolateral, primarily through the ventrolateral nucleus to the motor cortex. Also the pons, which, why would that lead to similar things as cerebellar damage?
See input.
It's the input pathways to the cerebellum. So basically, either the cerebellum or the projections to or from it will lead to ataxia. And in speech, the ataxia usually occurs with damage to the superior cerebellar artery, which feeds, amongst other things, the lateral hemispheres of the cerebellar cortex, the superior cerebellar cortex, where lobule 6 is. Ataxic dysarthria is, well, what would we expect it to be characterized by, just based on what we know the cerebellum does? And what characteristics of speech would you expect if your cerebellum is damaged compared to normal? So maybe jerkiness, not as smooth, not as well coordinated, poorly timed. So, and these are the things you see, and that leads to the perception of kind of drunkenness almost in the speech when you hear it. It's slurred, usually slower, and there's often a quality that's called scanning speech, which basically means that the prosody isn't normal. Instead, each word is, you know, a separate unit almost, and longer utterances, problems start happening toward the end of them in particular. You can completely fall off. So poorly timed articulations and uncoordinated articulations are the main characteristics of ataxic dysarthria. The speech movements aren't necessarily smaller in ataxic dysarthria. Sometimes they're bigger. In fact, they're just much more poorly coordinated. The cerebellum has actually a net inhibitory effect because the output neurons of the cerebellar cortex, the Purkinje neurons, are inhibitory. So if your cerebellar cortex is damaged, you actually remove inhibition of movements. And so you might get extra muscle activation from that as well. Usually you see low resting muscle tone in ataxic dysarthria. It is often caused by strokes that affect the superior cerebellar artery, as I mentioned, but also there are degenerative diseases. And one of the few that affects children, Friedreich's ataxia, is one of those. And so Friedreich's ataxia usually comes on around 10 to 15 years of age, and is a gradual degenerative disorder, and it causes a lot of different movement problems, especially not just movement problems, but it is one of the few disorders where that's degenerative, but it occurs early in life. MS is another example where, in this case, white matter pathways are affecting the functioning through the cerebellum. TBI, where, so of course, you get injure directly the cerebellum through hitting it with something or poking something into it, that'll cause a problem. And a very common cause of this is alcoholism also. So alcoholism is basically one of the things it causes is that you don't eat enough proper nutrients and you have toxic stuff in your system. And that combination is particularly problematic for the cerebellum, apparently, because ataxic dysarthria is quite common in extreme alcoholism, chronic alcoholism.
Are these different dysarthrias clinically diagnosed just like qualitatively?
By behaviors, yeah, mainly, yeah. Very rarely, I would say, does somebody get a brain. Well, I mean, they may eventually get a brain scan, but usually in a clinic, you do a sequence of tests. If you have motor strength, then you're not dysarthric, you're something else. If you don't have motor strength, then you figure out which one it is. And I think there are many cases where it's not definitive just based on the behavior. I certainly cannot always, like, when I see some of these, it could be one of a number of things as far as I can tell, but So there's a lot of overlap in the symptoms, but if you're a trained speech language pathologist, this is what you do. You figure out which one of these is that it's best associated with. Okay, so cerebellum, again, is mostly thought of as a motor thing, and motor execution is usually the most blatant problem you have if you have ataxic dysarthria. But also there are high level things that the cerebellum contributes to, and including timing of motor programs and so forth, and working memory and language. And so a number of other things will happen that are kind of higher level things that really are not studied that much, mainly because the focus is on the motor thing that's causing the biggest problems. But because the cerebellum is involved in so many different things, damage to the cerebellum affects not just motor execution, but in language it can affect working memory, for example, and motor programming. So maybe sequencing through the motor programs becomes more difficult as well. Perhaps not as much as the basal ganglia, but still the cerebellum is involved in those things. And so you do have these other things happening. Yes. Yep.
Why is the toxicity more associated with ataxic dysarthria versus the other dysarthrias?
I think because the cerebellum must be particularly sensitive to alcohol poisoning, because first of all, when you're drunk, that's probably why I mean, you look ataxic, and I think it's so certain disorders are just more likely to affect certain brain structures, and this is one of them where I think alcohol poisoning is more of a problem. Whereas hypoxia, like lack of oxygen, the hippocampus is hit really hard. And so amnesia is a common thing that happens with that kind of problem. And that happens before other areas get damaged. So those are the things you see first. Probably all of the brain is not working as well under extreme cases of malnutrition and alcohol poisoning or toxicity. And but the one that shows up most is the cerebellum. The literature, if you look at the literature, I've just summarized it with 4 red dots. These are the areas that most commonly cause ataxic dysarthria, and it's not surprising that it is the cerebellar hemispheres. There's not really much of a laterality thing, although maybe a bit more with right hemisphere, but left hemisphere certainly has been reported as well as the area of damage. And then the dentate nucleus, which the dentate nucleus, so these are the deep cerebellar nuclei, as we recall, and the dentate are the ones that are more kind of premotor or prefrontal cortex, and they're the ones that are by far bigger in humans than they are in other animals. So not surprising that speech and language, which are human specific traits, rely heavily on that dentate nucleus. And so these deep cerebellar nuclei locations can also cause ataxic dysarthria. It's not just lobule 6, sometimes lobule 5 is damaged, sometimes lobule 7, but generally many of the studies don't say what lobule, they'll just say parapermal, left cortex or whatever, so you can't say for sure, but if it's in the superior cerebral cortex, it's like there are very good odds that it's going to hit lobule 6 amongst other things in the paravermal and lateral regions, which are the crucial ones for speech. Okay, and all of these things, again, are the ones that are supplied by the superior cerebellar artery. One thing that is kind of a source of possible confusion is that we know that superior cerebellar artery causes ataxia, and we know that it feeds all of those areas, but we don't know that all of those areas are actually responsible for the ataxia. Sometimes, like if an artery feeds a certain chunk of the brain, everything in that chunk of the brain could die, and only some of it might be relevant to the behavior that you're looking at. So just because, it could be that dentate, actually maybe it really isn't involved, but it just is always damaged if you have superior cerebellar artery damage, in which case it would show up in the literature as well. I don't think that's true, but that dentate, I think dentate probably does cause ataxia, but just note of caution when interpreting stroke-related things, because although the strokes vary from person to person, if it's major artery and it's clogged in a particular place, then there is a big chunk of the brain that will commonly be damaged. We'll talk about this again when we talk about anterior insula being involved in apraxia of speech, because there's actually been a big argument in the literature about whether that's because it really truly is, or is it because it's just the area that's most often damaged with damage to a particular artery. Okay, so if we damage the cerebellum, are we going to mostly impact feed-forward control, feedback control, or both? Both. It's involved in both, but as with the other disorders, the feed-forward part is the part that's going to have the biggest effect, most likely. In feedback control, the cerebellum may have a role in fine timing of the targets. So maybe you're not quite as good at detecting errors, and also would have some effect probably on the feedback-based projections from the hypothesized feedback control map. Both of these things could impair feedback control. In an adult, those things would be highly secondary to the major problem of the feed-forward system being messed up. However, in children, it could be that these things are a bigger problem if they're damaged, if ataxia happens, because that would affect not only your feed-forward control, but it would affect the development of your motor programs as well, because of course, the feedback control mechanisms are very much involved in development of the appropriate motor programs. Okay. Did I play? Have I played it? I did not play again. He better sound drunk after all of that. Or she.
Well, I think it started around June, before or after. It became intense at that point. I guess I played dumb before that. I'm sure it happened sooner. But my wife noticed it later than other people. And now where I used to speak automatically, I have to think about what I say when I say it. And I have to speak much slower.
And if you don't do that, what happens?
Well, I slur it and it comes out garbled. It doesn't come out full words. The longer the words it is.
And you discovered that if you speak more slowly, you do better.
A lot better. And if I think about it, I do a lot better.
So let's think about those two things he just mentioned. Why would thinking about it be important when he's speaking? What has to overcome the problems from the cerebellum not doing its job? The cortex. So the cerebral cortex, where thinking occurs for the most part, has to be more invoked, presumably in these patients, to produce speech. And so you noticed he said things that used to happen automatically. Automatic, that's either basal ganglia or cerebellum, most likely, these sorts of things. That's gone, and now he has to think about them to overcome that issue. And then what about slowing down? Why is that?
Less coordinated, less like something there.
Right, so the cerebellum is particularly interested in fast movement coordination. The faster you move, you get an explosion of complications due to inertia and all that. If you speak very slowly, those things go away, more or less. Like you don't have to worry about the articulators having momentum going one direction if they're moving very slowly. And slowing down speech not only helps with that, but it also allows you to, a slower speech is usually more intelligible, so it overcomes to some degree poor articulation coordination in these cases. So it's very telling, what these patients think is how they have to overcome these things. And we'll see the same thing when we talk about Parkinson's and the basal ganglia, where thinking about it is important, not so much the speed. But okay. Sure. But both feed-forward and feedback pathways can be involved. All right, the next two that we'll look at, I believe these are the last two of the dysarthrias, are hypokinetic and hyperkinetic dysarthria. And both of them appear to involve basal ganglia, and that is not terribly surprising because basal ganglia is involved in initiating and scaling the sizes of movements and maintaining motor programs. And if your basal ganglia is overcharged, you're going to have too much movement being commanded or initiated. And if it's under performing, then you'll get hypokinetic dysarthria. Can somebody interpret that in a slightly more specific manner regarding basal ganglia pathways? What kind of, so we got the direct and indirect pathways. What would lead to too much movement? So they're balanced normally. If the direct pathway is too strong relative to the indirect pathway, then too much movement is going to happen because we're not going to be inhibiting enough movements. The direct pathway excites them, the indirect pathway inhibits them. And not surprisingly, the opposite, if the indirect pathway is too strong, then you're going to be inhibiting movements too much. And that is what happens in Parkinson's disease and hypokinetic dysarthria. The indirect pathway is too strong and the direct pathway is too weak.
So does the disease cause a weakness or like just like a strengthening?
You don't necessarily see, so you can see rigidity, which is kind of in some, weakness is a little bit subjective because you might not be able to lift much, but you might have a lot of rigidity, like the muscles could be very coactive and rigid. So it isn't necessarily underactivity of the muscles in Parkinson's, for example.
Like, is it a decrease in activity of the direct pathway versus?
Well, it depends on the disorder. Yeah, but
I think
in Parkinson's,
though, it's like one path, there'll be a deficit in one pathway, which as a result of that deficit, the other one is relatively stronger, but it's not necessarily that that's increasing.
Yeah, so
then
I'll do it with my balancing hands. This is the direct, this is the indirect, this is Parkinson's. This is some forms of hyperkinetic dysarthria due to too much dopamine. Maybe it's more like this. But any of these, so in Parkinson's, this is the case, but what they do to fix it in terms of deep brain stimulation is this, not this. So they rebalance it, not at the normal level, but at a different adjusted level, and that rebalancing it fixes it. So more important than the strength of any individual pathway is the balance of the two pathways in terms of interpreting these things at least. So anytime the direct pathway is too strong relative to the indirect pathway, you'll have too much movement. And if it's the opposite, if the indirect pathway is too strong relative to the direct pathway, you'll get too little movement overall. I mean, very roughly speaking, but Parkinson's patients have excess movements as well, like tremor and things like that, because not all of sending commands to the motor articulator, some of that is meant to be inhibitory as well as excitatory. So rigidity and things like that can also happen. But very roughly speaking, anything. And why does a decrease in dopamine cause Parkinson's symptoms, according to that explanation? Dopamine excites the direct pathway and it inhibits the indirect pathway. So basically, by reducing dopamine, you're doing both of these things. You're like decreasing the strength of the direct pathway, but also disinhibiting the indirect pathway. And so both of those effects, that makes it harder for you to choose the right motor program, but it also means you're inhibiting everything a lot more too from the indirect pathway. So that's in effect why dopamine. And so what would you predict would have with excess dopamine? Hyperkinetic dysarthria, and in fact, that is one of the causes of hyperkinetic dysarthria. Okay, so hypokinetic dysarthria, the most commonly reported thing is what's called hypophonia, which is basically that your voice is not loud enough. So you see a reduced vocal loudness, the voice tends to be more monotone, less manipulation of the laryngeal like pitch, basically. Breathy voice, so perhaps the vocal folds aren't closing as well as they could from underactivation. The rough quality of the voice is probably related to that as well. So if the vocal folds don't close well enough, you don't get a really nice oscillatory vocal fold signal. Instead, you get more kind of noisy and rough stimulation of the vocal folds, so that your voice quality is impaired from that. If you're not able to close the vocal folds enough, that also means it's going to take a lot of air to create speech, and your ability to activate the muscles of the breathing apparatus are also impaired. So those things kind of have a synergistic effect in decreasing the overall loudness. Other things kind of vary sometimes. Often you'll see reduced articulatory movement speeds, and some of these things depend on what stage of the disorder you're in. I'm going to kind of do first order pass a bit of what you see, but bradykinesia is just reduced movement speeds, reduced ability to make fast and long movements. Sometimes there's a delay in the initiation of a movement, and that's called akinesia. So you have a hard time starting production of speech, for example, or if something's ongoing, you might have trouble stopping it also. And these speak very much to the initiation, the gating on and gating off of motor programs by the basal ganglia. If you first of all have trouble gating it on, and you have trouble keeping it on or turning it off and turning something else on. You also get some blurring and imprecise articulations, so almost as if more than one motor program is being executed, like you're not waiting long enough in between them, possibly. And so the speech actually can be faster, as I mentioned a few times, in terms of overall duration, but the movements are not faster. They're usually slower, reduced movements, and they're just terminated too early. And that leads to the perception of speech. And often this can happen toward the end of its life. And it gets faster and faster toward the end, as if you're just really running out of energy for keeping motor programs active. Here's an example of Parkinson's speech. This works. Oh, well.
Do you notice any changes in your speech or your voice that you would associate with Parkinson's?
You can hear it.
Yes, I don't speak loud enough a lot of times.
Anything else?
Hoarse.
Oh, so in this example, by the way, we are going to hear about
I stutter, which I never did.
the main behavioral treatment for Parkinson's, which is called Lee Silverman voice treatment, even though that it's used beyond voice now. Or LSVT is what everybody calls it, or LSVT loud, if you're specifically talking about speech. But basically, this treatment is speak louder all the time, and remember to speak louder all the time. It's that, every day for 4 hours, basically. I don't know, I've never actually been through the therapy, but that is by far the primary thing. And it seems like it works quite well while you're consciously thinking about doing it, but as soon as you quit consciously thinking about speaking louder, it goes away. And Parkinson's patients have an interesting misperception of the loudness of their own voice. They think they're being perfectly fine, and yet they're not. They're not loud enough. They're not activating the muscles enough. And so this is kind of suggestive of maybe in their head, like let's say their premotor cortex is trying to talk loud. Let's say it's sending signals over to the auditory cortex saying what it's trying to do. Maybe somehow that impairs your ability to perceive how loud you actually are. Like you're trying hard, therefore it feels like you're loud, but you're not. And so they constantly have to be reminded to speak louder. And even though in their minds it may seem like they're yelling, it'll be easier to understand. And actually you'll see that she does sound like she's yelling at one point in this. But right now you're hearing her before treatment, and then she's going to talk after treatment, and you'll see what kind of difference it makes.
Before. Do this
She's
one
not
if you
too
would take a
severe.
deep breath and say ah for as long as you can.
So very quiet, rough voice quality, rappy.
Okay. Would you say Parkinson's disease has caused you to talk less?
Yes,
Because
because I stutter and then I can't be heard.
Note that
There's
she
noise in the
stutters now.
house, like when the kids come over. Nobody pays attention to me because they can't hear me. So I get mad and then yell.
She didn't used to stutter
take a
before.
deep breath and say ah for as long as you can.
You got to see the picture of her. But it is far more intelligible, basically, and she is able to do it if she really tries hard to do this. I think she's relatively early stage, I would say, and that so she can do this well. Like she can actually say, "Well, listen to her."
Have you noticed changes in your speech or your voice as a result of the speech therapy?
Oh, yes.
What have you noticed?
I talk louder. I think louder.
Interestingly,
I'm going to sing with the Son of the Pioneers one of these days with my
Good for you. That's excellent. What practicing do you do at home?
my ahs, my eyes, and my lows. And I read out the mail out loud.
You feel like practicing helps?
Oh, yes.
Do you feel as though people can understand you all of the time now?
Majority of the time, unless it's my husband, and he'll say, "Well, I can't hear you."
Good for you.
But I think he does that just to be cute.
Has anyone commented that it's easier to understand you now?
Oh, yes, I set some of our friends back when we went to their house and I talked loud. Lou says, "What the hell happened to you?" My daughter said, "Oh, Ma, that's you?"
Good. Don't you feel wonderful?
Oh, yeah, because now she can say, "I didn't understand what you said."
No excuses, right?
Yeah, no excuses.
so basically, this treatment does work behaviorally, but the problem with this and many other treatments is as soon as you leave the clinic and spend some time without somebody repeatedly telling you to speak louder, you tend to quit doing it again. And so again, they have to think about it to make it work. Again, it's a subconscious, subcortical part of the brain that's impaired, and the cortex is probably having to do a lot more work. So likely if you did an fMRI, you would see that her premotor cortex is much, much more active now than it was, when she's, because of this therapy, when she's thinking about being loud. But as soon as she stops thinking about speaking loudly and things start becoming automatic again, then it quits working, basically. So that, again, ties in with what we saw with the cerebellum patients. They have to think about this to overcome it all the time. But there are big differences here where cerebellum patients knows that they're saying things loud or not, or are slurred or not. Parkinson's patients usually do not realize that they're not speaking loud enough. I mean, they may be told this repeatedly, but they, it's hard for them to maintain doing this.
Does that change at all with drugs?
So I don't know about the combination of drugs and the therapy. Drugs also improve speech as well, but in that case, they are not.
Maybe Dopamine has something shown to have much of effect on speech. There's like some.
Well, so those are the Parkinson's literature largely focuses on arm movements and tremor because those are often the worst things. And there's actually an equivalent of LSVT loud, which is called LSVT big, I believe, which is try to make bigger movements, and similarly helps you overcome issues with other, walking or using your arms. But again, they have to think about it. And again, what was the question about?
Just in terms of what effect does medication have on
Like
Correct.
auditory perception.
Yeah, but there are a bunch of studies that have done.
Right. So the study, the thing is that often, so if the treatment is aimed at your articulations, its effect on speech is more variable. But you can make it, so if they adjust it to improve speech, according to Mark Richardson, who will pop up in our next video, strangely enough, that you can focus on the speech and make the speech better, but likely the reason that it isn't always good for your speech is that they were really trying to fix your tremors, and what fixes your tremor may actually impair your speech. And deep brain stimulation, we're jumping ahead, but it's a complicated thing. I mean, the first order kindergarten version is you stimulate the indirect pathway, which impairs its performance, and that balances the two, but it depends on the frequency of stimulation. Some people need a different frequency of stimulation than others. Some frequencies will help one set of symptoms, but impair another. And so there aren't as many studies that have looked at direct effects of speech, but when I have gone back and looked through to try to verify, it doesn't work for speech, that's not what these papers are saying. It's that the speech characteristics don't always do the same thing that the motor characteristics do. It's more that. So it can be variable, but I think that's true of tremor too. I suspect that you could probably make tremors worse by poorly stimulating with DBS as well. So you have to tune it to fix what you want to fix most. And depending on what your worst symptoms are, that may be, it's usually not speech, it's usually something else. That's usually what's fixed. And that may impact your speech. So getting rid of tremor in most people is the biggest thing, because that's just like a constant nightmare. And then, but then they speak more slowly often, or things like that as a result. But in the cases where it works, I think they speak more loudly. Basically, I mean, working almost is defined as speaking more loudly.
And in the studies that have looked at it, they're not manipulating the drug or the level, that and things. It's always like the standard of care medication on versus off.
Right.
And in those there aren't much difference in this. A bunch of acoustic studies, conceptual studies, and generally it's equivocal with
right. In my mind, that a lot of that is because they're not focusing on the speech with the treatment. But,
that makes sense.
Yeah, and there are many reports of speech being impaired by DBS. And
All right. So what do you do when you want to be as equal?
Okay. All right, so what's going on here? So we know that there are projections from all these speech motor related areas into the putamen, and we know that, so in the Parkinson's, so the putamen gets the dopamine from the substantia nigra pars compacta. This nucleus is very much impaired in Parkinson's disease, and that decreases dopamine, not just to the basal ganglia. So there are a number of other things like prefrontal cortex. So Parkinson's patients tend to have a much higher incidence of depression, possibly related to the lack of dopamine. It's disproportional compared to other people with disorders. So it's not just they're depressed because of their disorder, it's probably the dopamine to prefrontal cortex having an effect there. But the biggest effect on motor output is because of the putamen. And if you decrease the dopamine, and so decreasing here is thinner lines, and increasing is the thicker lines. If you decrease the dopamine, the direct pathway gets weaker. So the green here is the direct pathway that bypasses the GPE. And that, because of the inhibition, eventually leads to decreased thalamic activation of cortex. And the indirect pathway simultaneously is over excited because it actually is inhibited by dopamine. So taking dopamine away causes these neurons to fire more, which leads to more inhibition. So both of those together have the same effect, which is to reduce the overall movement compared to the normal case. There are parts of this pathway that are more active. So GPI is going to be much more active in Parkinson's disease because the GPI is inhibiting movement and decreasing it. And the way you make a movement happen is you shut off the GPI, you pause it, and that releases the thalamus to generate the movements. And so there is, parts of this pathway that are hyperactive as well, but the net effect is a decrease of cortical activation. We just talked about the main behavioral treatment, Lee Silverman voice treatment for patients with Parkinson's disease. I don't know how, so you probably have a better sense of how, are there cases where they really do get a long-term benefit?
I don't know.
Because it's very widespread.
It is, yeah. Well, I think a lot of that comes down to like
there's not much else you can do.
Right, but it's also like an established for-profit company that
right.
A good marketing team behind them. But it seems they haven't been very clear on who this works for, and more importantly, who doesn't work for it. So my sense from reading their papers and efficacy, whatever, is that it works pretty well for mild patients, early stages who have primarily monetary deficits. As soon as you start to see articulation, like really, like a lot of difficulties with articulation,
yeah, I mean, I could imagine it helping if there was, a whole lot of articulatory component. Like imagine opening your mouth much wider and exaggerating all your movements.
Yep.
Because that does, that's basically what happens with our movements. But any of these treatments work better on mild cases also. So and at some point, all of them quit working in Parkinson's disease.
Yeah.
So
they did publish one paper that was like a 2-year follow-up, but I think it's just really difficult to measure these effects because they come in for like their pre and post therapy assessment, but as soon as they're in the clinic, you have this effect of you're cueing
context specific
they're cued
learning
by the fact that they're there and that you're there, and
right. But they do a lot of report, like they interview your family and things like that for studies to see if they think that you've improved. But I'm not all that familiar with the literature, but what I've heard from anybody who isn't involved in making money from it is that it tends to wear off fairly quickly, and it's still, still hard. They have to think about talking about it. Although for this woman, for example, she didn't seem to be having to think about it that much. She was certainly capable of having a perfectly fine conversation. So,
and like speaking louder or other kind of strategies like that are definitely helpful, but the extent to which they lost effects is a widespread issue.
And it's always going to be the case for neurodegenerative disorders that just get worse and worse and worse over time until they're fatal. Eventually, everything stops working. So, L-DOPA is the main levodopa is the main pharmacological treatment that increases dopamine levels in the striatum. So that kind of counteracts directly the dopamine reduction due to the damage to the substantia nigra. Another thing that's done and often works better than L-DOPA. So a lot of people will start off with L-DOPA and behavioral treatments, and then when things get bad enough, they may move on to deep brain stimulation. It involves neurosurgery, so of course you're not going to want to jump right in there, but it is a very safe surgery and highly effective in many cases. So the targets of deep brain stimulation are generally targets in the indirect pathway. So the two main targets are the subthalamic nucleus and the internal segment of the globus pallidus, both of which are only in the indirect pathway. And those have external segment is the one that is in the indirect pathway. Sorry, I think I messed that up. The external segment is usually what they implant, and the subthalamic nucleus. But basically, the structures that are in the indirect pathway. And the idea is that it's a virtual lesion, but it's not nearly that simple as I've mentioned. It depends very much on the magnitude and the frequency of the stimulation. So they have to set a bunch of parameters, and then they'll come back and adjust the parameters after some time off medication, and optimize the stimulation for your particular case. And even during the surgery, they're testing as they go in to figure out where to stop, like where to leave the electrode so you're awake during the surgeries and you're moving, and when your symptoms get better, that's when they know they hit the right spot, basically. And so I don't know how long they spend doing this tuning process during surgery, but they do make it personalize it for you. And also, depending on whether you hit the subthalamic nucleus or the the globus pallidus, you'll have different effects. So one of them, I can't remember which, is more effective on tremor, whereas the other is more effective on bradykinesia. But it depends, sometimes, they both can affect both. But let's take a quick look at the differences between the two. So GPE, I believe, is what that was supposed to say, and that's this pathway. So it projects to the STN, and then both of them project to the GPI. One difference is that the GPE has specific connections to the GPI, meaning that one neuron projects to a small number of neurons in the GPI, whereas the STN is very diffuse, meaning that one neuron projects to a whole bunch of the GPN. So this is likely part of why they have some differential effects. Because if you stimulate STN, it's going to be less specific to a particular motor system. So let's say, for example, that your speech was fine, but your movements were messed up, and so they went into STN and they fixed your movements. That quite likely is going to change the balance for your speech, and quite possibly in a negative way. Whereas that might not happen potentially with GPE because of the specificity of the connections. This is all hunch on my part about the specificity of the connections playing a role. These things are still not fully understood, but they do know that there are some differential outcome likelihoods depending on which of those two structures you stimulate. And I'm not really entirely sure if they base the decision entirely on your behavioral symptoms, or if there are other considerations like how you react to L-DOPA and so forth. Okay. Oh, here's an example of the brain stimulation effects. I just found this today when I was looking for examples on Parkinson's, and it happens to involve Mark Richardson, the guy who just moved here in the J. Boland trade with Pittsburgh. Oh, this one you want to see. Let me see if I can. Fortunately, there's a
My name is David Smith. I'm undergoing an evaluation for DBS for treatment of Parkinson's.
Okay, this is going to be a lot better if you can see it. So just give me a second here.
Did you stop sharing?
Yeah, where's this? I gotta go.
Can you go onto that screen?
It's not that way. There it is. Okay, got it. All right. And now back to the screen. All right. Wait.
So then this will not be on the video. Right? If you're not sharing anymore. You share.
That's right.
Okay. Reshare. Yeah.
But why? I better.
Oh, you have to drag this over.
I have to move my PowerPoint presentation.
No, you just have to move this.
You can see it here, right?
Yeah.
So this is before surgery.
Open and close.
David had probably the worst tremor I've ever seen from Parkinson's disease. It's very high amplitude tremor and with high frequency. He was a very normal, nice guy. Couldn't stop shaking, completely wet with sweat the first time I saw him walking through.
So he's an example where speech was fine, pretty much, but the movement. Real time start, that's it. I don't know if he talks to us. Anyway, dramatic improvement in his movement abilities for sure.
Had Parkinson's for about 11.5 years. I said, there will be a cure someday, but this is my cure for now.
So this might be one of those cases where his speech actually may have been somewhat impaired by the surgery, but it got rid of the primary problem that he was having, which was the tremor. My chair is great. Right. Figure this out. Oh, no, my entire Zoom went down. All right, well, at least I'm going to finish the lecture. I can do that. This work. All right. I think we're going to lose it on Zoom, unfortunately. I think I somehow killed Zoom.
Do you want to stop the recording? Or just keep it with the audio? They could follow
Yeah,
along
that's
with
right.
the
They can
slide.
still hear the audio.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So that's Parkinson's. So at one level, we already kind of understand why this is happening because we know that you're turning on and turning off motor programs in Parkinson's disease. But what else is the basal ganglia involved in heavily that we've talked about in complex speech tasks? Selection and sequencing, basically. So sequencing, especially the automated part of sequencing. And a couple of weeks ago when we talked about sequencing, we talked about how initially maybe cortex has to sequence things, but the basal ganglia learns to sequence them later. Well, what would happen then? Here, this is schematizing that. This is for the word blue, let's say. And let's say early in development, which is not, this isn't really true, but the basic idea of having to sequence through the thing cortically and activate the gestures, that becomes automated through the basal ganglia loops so that you just activate the whole blue motor program and the sequencing through the gestures happens through the basal ganglia loops. Well, this is going to get impaired anytime the basal ganglia is impaired. And that could lead to something like stuttering, which is what we'll talk about next week. But you may have noticed that the first Parkinson's patient we looked at had an acquired stutter that occurred from Parkinson's. And one of the things we're going to talk about is maybe something, maybe stuttering is because these pathways aren't working right. And so you're not able to generate through the rest of the utterance. That seems like it might be the case. And in the case of the Parkinson's patient, maybe they have to start, thinking more about it and not necessarily fully consciously thinking about moving their lips and so forth, but thinking about what they're doing to make cortex work better in order to be able to sequence through something that normally the basal ganglia would have done the sequencing for. This view suggests that you should probably be impaired in learning new sequences as well, because learning them means putting them into these basal ganglia loops, and dopamine is heavily involved in that kind of motor learning. And in fact, that is the case. There are studies showing that if you have to learn a new foreign language, you're impaired in Parkinson's disease or other non-speech sequences, you're impaired in your ability to learn new sequences, which also makes sense within this idea of the basal ganglia taking over the sequencing of the turning on and turning off motor programs. But hyperactivity is frequently seen in Parkinson's in the lateral premotor cortical areas, in keeping with this basic idea that your premotor thinking cortex has to do much more of the work because your basal ganglia cannot do the automated part anymore. Okay, that's hypokinetic dysarthria. The next thing we'll talk about is hyperkinetic dysarthria. And at least one of, if not the main source of that, is the sort of opposite problem in the basal ganglia. So again, it's going to be the basal ganglia that's impaired here. And so initiation of movements and maintaining of motor programs is the problem. But now the problem is you're generating too many initiating too many motor programs, sometimes overlapping them, sometimes motor programs that shouldn't have any business being in there. And so in hyperkinetic dysarthria, you often see just general excessive movements, tics, arm movements, head movements. When we'll look at, maybe we'll see the video of somebody speaking, and you'll see that their head is doing a lot of odd movements, and disorders that cause that include Tourette's syndrome and Huntington's disease, amongst others. So the symptoms of hyperkinetic, you have a tremor, which is small amplitude movements, which is odd in some sense because you get tremor also in the Parkinson's case. I don't know if the tremors are different frequencies or if there's like gross level differences between the tremors you see in the two disorders, but keep in mind that we have both excitatory and inhibitory movements that we're trying to command, and tremor is an imbalance in them, and it could occur in a couple of different ways, and it seems to be that that is the case. Spasms are another thing where the muscle contractions are super strong and maybe not appropriate, like you don't even want to activate the muscles, and yet they become activated. Myoclonus, which is a short muscle contraction, so kind of like a quick tick or jerk type movements. Tics, which are very similar. And chorea, which is a word for dance. And basically, these are slower contractions, but they're kind of like tremors, except that they last such a long time that you see much bigger movements being carried out. And so you start seeing movement sequences. It almost looks like some sort of weird dance or something. And that's where the term chorea comes from. And that's very common with Huntington's disease. In fact, it's Huntington's chorea is often the term that's used to describe that. One other thing that can happen, which is dystonia. There's some question about whether dystonia is, at least in terms of classification, really a hyperkinetic dysarthria. I'm lumping it in here regardless because it, again, involves over-contracting the muscles. Dystonia is usually over co-contraction of muscles. And so spasmodic dysphonia is a form of dystonia. That's when the vocal fold muscles usually are too tight. They're too tightly contracted, and that causes, as you might imagine, first it's tiring. Secondly, it causes impairments in voice signal and makes it very difficult to produce normal voice signals. So you can see dystonias in Huntington. So dystonia is unfortunate, is used in different ways. It's used as a description of a symptom of hyperkinetic dysarthria, but it's also, some dystonias are considered separate. So there's a focal dystonias, for example, some people consider them separate, and spasmodic dysphonia, I believe now is officially classified as a focal dystonia rather than a hyperkinetic dysarthria, but it has a whole lot in common with the hyperkinetic dysarthrias, including the dystonia part, which happens with a lot of them. So in my mind, I don't know, those classifications are, we have to get to the bottom of what's actually causing this spasmodic dysphonia to really have a best idea where it should be classified, I think. Okay, well, this figure is the same as that previous one I showed, except now there's too much dopamine, there can be. So for example, one of the causes of this is too much dopamine or too effective dopamine transmission, meaning that somehow the dopamine system is hyper functioning. It may not just, so it could be because there's actually more dopamine in there, but it could also be that the receptors for dopamine are much more sensitive. They're too sensitive to dopamine, and therefore they become hyperactive and have their stronger effects than normal on the indirect and direct pathways. But basically, all of those things have the effect of strengthening the direct pathway now, which releases movement signals to the cortex and causes excessive movements. All right, well, Huntington's disease is an example of hyperfunction of the dopaminergic system, and Huntington's is a hereditary disease involving neural degeneration in the striatum, and the type of degeneration leads to overly sensitive, hypersensitivity to dopamine. Basically, the dopamine system, even though there may or may not be too much dopamine, it's acting as if there's too much dopamine. It's too dopamine sensitive. It's characterized by chorea and other of the dyskinesia symptoms I mentioned before in its earlier stages. But as it progresses, it eventually becomes similar to Parkinson's in that movement starts to just not happen anymore, like when degeneration gets really bad. And Huntington's is pretty much always fatal, I believe. So it goes through these stages of, first you see all the symptoms due to relatively mild impairment, but by the time the system becomes dramatically impaired, it doesn't work at all. There's no generation of movement at all. Tardive dyskinesia is another thing that can happen. This happens usually when you take neuroleptic drugs for a long period of time. So schizophrenia, there seems to be some link between dopamine and schizophrenia. It is not entirely clear, but one of the problems that happens if you take these neuroleptic drugs too long is you become too sensitive to dopamine. And so, treatment for schizophrenia causes this tardive dyskinesia, which is a hyper, and so you have to quit using the neuroleptic drugs. And I think it's still reversible at that point, but it becomes a balancing act of what's worse, which one do you want to try to fix. It's, again, unwanted stereotype movements. In this case, they're stereotyped. So lip smacking, tongue protrusion, jaw opening and closing. These are all things that happen. Those are relatively low-level motor things. Tourette's syndrome can be things like that, but it can also go to higher-level things where you'll start to have inappropriate bursts of speech and things like this that just come out, you cannot stop them. And again, it seems to be a basic ganglia related thing that's hyperactivity in the direct or hypoactivity in the indirect pathway that causes it. Tourette's also seems to be largely hereditary as well, much like Huntington's.
In tardive dyskinesia, do those like stereotype motor movements they work as individual controls, or is it at risk of multiple stereotype movements happening at once? Like they're not going to accidentally move their jaw at the same time they have a tongue movement and bite their tongue.
They might. I think it's it's independent. So it'll depend on severity and so forth and where you are in the progression. But yeah, I think there is that possibility. And they hurt people with at least Huntington's, I know, hurt themselves a lot. So they often have to be restrained because they're just banging themselves against stuff all the time. And I would imagine that applies to their tongue being susceptible to damage from excessive jaw movements. So I think
it's not coordinated excessive movements in any way. Because like banging your arm against something, you're hitting it against something extra.
It's not coordinated. Yeah.
It wouldn't be like if it sends a jaw movement motor program, but it also could send a tongue movement or motor program unrelated.
Yeah. So, for example, you might be speaking and then suddenly your jaw spasms. So you might have regular motor programs going there, and then all of a sudden you get a big jaw spasm that could conceivably bite your tongue, but also will affect your speech as well. But I don't know how often you get multiple tics happening at the same time, but I can see no reason why that wouldn't happen at least. And severity varies dramatically. So you can see examples of people with Huntington's that are like all kinds of things are going on. It looks like a living hell, actually, basically an inability to stop yourself. So pretty nasty disorder.
Do any of these disorders influence linguistic areas, trace of words?
I don't think that's true of the basal ganglia disorders, but those, I mean, aphasias are, that's what aphasias are, basically. So that happens with cortical damage to IFG, and we haven't gotten that far up yet. Next week. Actually, we won't go all the way to
With
aphasia.
some motor disorders, at least some people have hypotheses about some linguistic related things. I don't really know much about it, but I know like
Well,
in ALS,
like-
for example, there's a
Well, and-
growing interest in motor linguistic
Right.
conditions.
And ataxia, I mentioned that you do have some of these, but usually, my understanding is usually those things are kind of subtle relative to the motor aspects of the disorder. So the working memory span might go from 10 to 8 or whatever. Right? There's going to be some change in it, but it's not like you quit. So normally cerebellum damage does not cause what we would call aphasia, for example, but it probably does have minor effects in your language because it affects your working memory, if nothing else. And
Yeah, kind of more
basically,
like cognitive communication issues.
yeah. And basal ganglia, well, we've talked mostly about the motoric components of it, but there's this prefrontal planning component of it we've talked a little bit about, but it goes even further forward than we've talked about into language areas. So it could very well have some language-related effects. I would imagine, somehow related to the role of automation, like maybe function words. Like some of these disorders, you lose certain kinds of parts of speech earlier than others, but with these, the dominant thing is the motor thing, and the cognitive components are usually more subtle. And, I mean, they wouldn't, like if you had aphasia, they would call it aphasia. They wouldn't, call it ataxia. If cerebellum damage was involved, they'd still call it aphasia. It would probably not be called. I mean, you might have both. You probably have both of them, but I don't think there's that much co-occurrence of aphasia and ataxia. So.
And for example, in Tourette syndrome, isn't that the words that they put out are like always like the similar types of words?
So a lot of people, inappropriate words pop out that are kind of automated words, like words, expletives you would say if you hit your thumb or something like that. Those things tend to pop out more, it seems, but just a lot of inappropriate, like it's the inappropriateness partly of when you're saying something, but also what you say. Often it's more like stuff that you would have inhibited otherwise. It's not,
But it's not going to be like full sentences, like "I hate your shoes." It's like,
well, it can be actually.
Really?
So yeah.
So that's a lot of motor complex going.
Right. So that's probably, again,
So it's just
more
inefficiency
interior it
with thinking
is, the bigger chunks of things that are going to be affected. And so there are definitely Tourette syndrome cases where people say entire sentences. And it's not always the same sentence and whatever, but I think they have some they're prone to saying a certain kind, whatever this person may say this phrase all the time, but they don't always say the exact, it varies. And they wax and wane, and whether it happens, sometimes it's completely under control, but then they'll have a bad day and it's terrible, and so forth.
I've never heard of it as multiple, like beyond a couple syllables.
Yeah, and sometimes there's no word, it's just ticks. It's not
Like sound.
It's not actual language, but other times they say. But I think it could entirely be these automated phrases where we have a whole phrase that we say something like, "Yeah, you look terrible. You look terrible," like something like that, where it's something that you might have said a million times before that, and then it somehow, hopefully you didn't say that. You might have thought it a million times. But you should keep that to yourself. Okay. Let's see. Oh, okay. Then one other hyperfunction. So sometimes Parkinson's disease patients, treatment can cause these things as well. So for example, if you have high doses of L-DOPA for a long time, it can cause hyperkinetic rather than hypokinetic symptoms. So all of this makes sense within the change in the balance of the basal ganglia, and maybe you went too far, and therefore you went the opposite, and now you got to rebalance it. Yeah. Okay, so here is a Huntington speech example.
Less, but he always is
And again, mild.
banana oil. Ground Father likes to be modern in his language.
I believe she's just trying to say all once, as long as possible. So they're also inappropriate stops as well as starts.
Once more. Please pay attention here to voice interruptions, intermittent tight hoarseness or breathiness, and note her quick head jerks. Her ah is variable in loudness and sometimes interrupted, breathy, or tight sounding. Regular with voice interruptions. Her loudness is quite variable. During conversation, you'd note her quick head jerks and irregular breakdowns of speech.
So I think here she's just trying to hold her tongue.
You also note a darting tongue and facial movements at times.
It's always excess movements.
It's very hard for me because I always have to think before I can talk to anybody.
Yet again,
I try to concentrate.
Concentrating before you
But
talk.
I have a hard time.
Now, you have some trouble with your thinking ability.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Because
It's very disappointing to me that they cut it right there because I wanted to hear what she was about to say, but such is YouTube. Okay, so those are the hyperkinetic dysarthrias. I'm going to talk about one which focal dystonias, which, as I mentioned, may or may not be a hyperkinetic dysarthria depending on who you're talking to and what exactly you're talking about. But a focal dystonia is, the focal part is that it only affects a single part of the body. And the most common focal dystonias for speech are oromandibular dystonia, which has to do with movements of the face and tongue and jaw. And so this could cause problems with non-speech things like chewing or swallowing, but also has an effect on speech. And spasmodic dysphonia, which is the speech-specific one, also called laryngeal dystonia. This is characterized by spasms in the muscles of the vocal tract. There are actually two forms of it, depending on which muscles are spasming. Adductor, which are the muscles that pull them together. That's the more common type, and that causes a very rough, like broken voice quality where the voicing will kind of be on and off inappropriately. It's supposed to be voicing continuously, but they can't quite hold it, and it sounds strained. Abductor is the muscles that pull the vocal folds apart. If they're spasming, then you can't fully close the vocal tract, the larynx and the glottis, and you get a breathy voice. You can't properly phonate the cause oscillations of the vocal folds. Instead, you can just kind of cause the equivalent of a breathy, whispery type voice. And so, first, the voice is not very loud, and secondly, yeah, again, the vocal signal is highly impaired. I think it's far more common to have the adductor than the abductor. Focal dystonias very often are happening in people who have to use whatever it is that becomes dystonic frequently. So singers, teachers who lecture a lot are prone to spasmodic dysphonia. And another focal dystonia is writer's cramp, which is focal dystonia of the hand. That happens to people who write a lot for a living. It happens like the cartoonist that does Dilbert, or one of the, he's Dilbert. He has writer's cramp, presumably from constantly doing that job. The yips in putting, I don't know if anybody knows anything about golf, but golf has this weird thing where people who played the game for 30 years will suddenly, when they're getting ready to putt, so putting, you're holding super still, and it's got to be very gentle. They get the yips, and when they're getting ready to putt, like little things like that happen, and their putting goes to hell, and they have to, like, professional golfers' careers end because of it. That may be a focal dystonia as well, because it's another case where you're constantly using these same muscles in the same task, And if you're prone to dystonia, then it might happen to you. And if it does happen to you, it's very likely to happen in something that you do very frequently. So
the idea of the yips being psychological is just like urban legend.
I believe, personally, I think that is correct. I mean, it almost certainly, so almost any disorder you have gets worse when you're anxious. And underperforming in a professional environment like that is anxiety inducing. And so to some degree, your ability to control your anxiety might help, but that's not, I don't think it's the underlying cause of the disorder. I think the underlying, it's probably a dystonia. When they look at monkeys in cases where they induce dystonia, so you can induce it sometimes by having the monkey do a repetitive finger task or something like this. What you see, if you look, the main neural thing that you notice is that there's somatosensory representations. So, neurons in the somatosensory system have what's called a receptive field. So some little surface part of the body causes them to activate, and then around that inhibits them usually or often. In these focal dystonias, and at least in animals, when you look, their receptive fields are gigantic. Like all the neurons have a huge receptive field. And so one possible thing that's happening is an over activation of the somatosensory system. And so it's possible that somatosensory feedback control may be part of the problem here, where you're getting too many error signals from the periphery that are spurious error signals, and that's causing incorrected movements. That's one possibility. The other possibility that's been discussed a lot is basal ganglia issues again, and that makes sense from the Debo model perspective, at least, of the initiation. You turn it on, and it's too intensely turned on, and that causes muscles to be too active, and that leads to the problems. So spasmodic dysphonia is still not all that well understood. We've done experiments to see if auditory feedback control might be involved, like maybe you're hearing your errors and that amplifies like in a positive feedback loop. That does not appear to be the case. You look at brain activity, there's hyperactivity in whether or not you have auditory feedback of your speech. So you can completely mask the speech and you still see the exact same pattern of hyperactivity that you see without noise masking. So can't just be auditory feedback control, but whether it's feed forward through this basal ganglia issue, or whether the somatosensory system somehow is in overdrive and that's causing some somatosensory feedback related hyperactivity, that's still, I think, a very open question. Oh, one of those where you can hold it.
Long ago, men found that it was easier to travel on water than on land. They needed a cleaner path, a clear path or road with traveling on land.
So you can, the warbling in there, you can almost hear the muscles spasming, basically. And so they're not just hyperactive, they're doing, spasms, so bursts of weird activity. And so you can hear breaks and things like that where the spasms are worse and better. And the warbling quality of the pitch, these are characteristic of this disorder. And so again, if it was just purely too much feed forward control, you wouldn't necessarily expect spasms. You would expect just hyper, activity. But then again, once you start over activating muscles, that may cause just physiological spasming in the muscle itself that has nothing to do with the central control. To me, at least, it's not entirely clear. One of the main experts on this these days is at Math Science Ear, Christina Simonian. She's doing a lot of neuroimaging work on this, a lot of neural work looking at the brains of people with both postmortem and premortem. And in postmortem cases, they found damage right near, but not in substantia nigra in subcortical areas. I forgot the name of the nucleus. Nucleus accumbens, I believe, that seems to be really degraded, at least in the few cases they looked at. So that would be near the dopamine system. Maybe it has the dopamine thing's a secondary effect. Still unclear, pretty much. The only treatment I know of for spasmodic dysphonia, other than don't talk as much, is injecting of Botox into the muscle, which basically just kills the muscle for a few months. And so you just weaken the muscles by killing some of the muscle fibers every few months, but you have to repeatedly do it. And I believe it's painful. I don't know about, I mean, the vocal fold part, I haven't even asked because I'm just assuming it's painful as hell, but I know that when they do it for other parts of the body, it's very painful, these shots. And usually you have to do it without you having anesthesia because they want to see if how much to put in, and is it working properly.
I used to work at a voice center at Johns Hopkins where they did those injections on the vocal folds,
Yeah.
and it was just all anesthetized.
They did it, and okay, so they do it. So for other kinds of dystonia, they don't anesthetize, so it's incredibly painful. But that's humane, at least, because I assume they're just going through here, right?
Sometimes they went through the neck, other times they would do it, which like sometimes hit the sides.
Right. Just thinking about that makes me think I'll just not talk anymore instead.
Based on the area, the spasmodic area, or was that based on the patient's anatomy and
It was based on the patient's preference.
Really?
Preference, so people would choose something.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they got the choice whether they wanted to go through the mouth or through the neck.
Yeah, Bob Hillman at the Voice Center at MGH, so that's one of the top places in the world for this, for treatment of this. The voice surgeon to the stars works there too, Steve Zeitel. He pops up on the news all the time. Like I was at the Who concert, and Roger Daltrey does this big 2-minute thing, how grateful he is to Steve Zeitel.
He's the reason that we have Adele's 25 album.
That's right. Adele also, there's a lot of them. And these are just the ones we hear about. But then I heard on the same Who tour in Texas, Roger Daltrey's voice gave out completely in the middle of the concert and ended. So he's not a complete miracle worker, I guess. But anyway, great place for postdocs, and that's where Kara got her. That's where she did her PhD work. Not a postdoc, I think it was just PhD. Oh, Steven Tyler was there. Mm-hmm. She tells the story that when she was in her office, Steven Tyler came in and knocked on her door. I was like, "Can you show me where Steve Zeitel's office is?" And she's like, "Yeah, walk this way," which is, of course, the most famous song by the Aerosmith.
Oh my God. Did you get it?
I don't think she did on purpose. Okay, what do we got? Having Zoom involved in this loop makes everything a bit more complicated. AV. All right. Botox. Botulinum toxin. And botulinum toxin is the most poisonous substance known to mankind. That, I believe, literally the single most poisonous substance, and yet that's what they use. Very tiny amounts of it, obviously. Okay, so yeah, as I mentioned, I think I probably covered all of this. One possible source of impairment is the impaired basal ganglia processing, but there's not a whole lot of evidence for that, actually, in terms of brain activity measures and stuff. You see a lot of cortical hyperactivity, and it's in the left hemisphere, which would suggest the feed-forward system. But as I mentioned, there's also this impairment of the somatosensory system that you see in animal models and is hinted to in some neuroimaging studies of humans, where the receptor fields become so big that pretty much all receptors get activated for any stimulation of the skin surface, say if it's a repetitive task that involves using your fingers, for example, to determine what you should do. We've done some simulations of the DIVA model just to see what kind of hyperfunction might be possible to cause spasmodic dysphonia. And what we found was that, indeed, it seems possible, at least with a fairly simplified model of the somatosensory system, to get the sort of behaviors you see with the spasms and the blocks. But there was no way, no matter how much we cranked up the auditory feedback control system, did it lead to those sorts of behaviors. So, and as I mentioned, we've tried masking auditory feedback, so it does not appear to be related to auditory feedback. It's either somatosensory or purely feed-forward. One thing to note about the somatosensory system also is that the receptors in the somatosensory system receive input from motor neurons, a different set of motor neurons called gamma motor neurons. So hyperactivity of the gamma motor neurons could actually cause hyperactivity in the somatosensory system indirectly, because even though they're motor outputs, they adjust the sensitivities of the muscle spindles because the muscle spindles are basically their set point of where they operate is dependent on this central descending command that basically activates the muscle spindle to a certain state, and then that makes the spindle sensitive to movements near that state, more or less. So if you overactivate it, it could be that it's just hypersensitive to every stimulus. This is what the cortical activity pattern looks like in our set of subjects that we had. So this is just spasmodic dysphonia patients, and they're just doing a very simple voicing task. I believe that this is just humming in this case, where they're just saying, oh no, this is short sentences, sorry. We had two tasks. So this, when they're speaking, and so here, this is what's most often noted. If it were so here's the question. Here's the pattern of activity, hyperactivity we see. So if it is the case that the basic ganglia is turning on too much, where else would we expect to see hyperactivity that we don't see it in this image? So what part of the cortex is most involved in the initiation map? That is involved, but it's the supplementary motor area. So we're talking about nodes in the supplementary motor area as being the kind of final decision to gate something on or off. You should, if things are just hyperactive, you would expect, at least on the surface of it, hyperactivity in SMA. Sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't. It is not as hyperactive as this. So that kind of speaks a little bit against it being a purely basal ganglia problem, but not necessarily. It's still open question. And I believe in this, we saw a little bit of right hemisphere SMA, but I'm not positive. But definitely the bulk of it. And what you see reported most is this. And also recall that we talked about two different language or larynx representations, one up here in the poorly named language, larynx motor area, and one down here in the other forgotten language larynx motor area. But in this group, at least, it's the lower one that's actually hyperactive, not the one that you would most, I mean, they're both kind of hyperactive, but the real peak of the activity is down here in this lower part where it's unclear exactly what this lower one is doing that's different from the upper one, but for what it's worth. And then we see that a little bit also in the right hemisphere. And somebody can make their career by figuring this out. One of you, some person in this room. Probably not me though. I'm moving away from spasmodic dysphonia. Okay, so that's it for this week. Next week, that's it, the last lecture, and it's going to be covering the higher order disorders, apraxia of speech, medial premotor syndromes, and stuttering. Medial premotor syndromes are things that happen with SMA, pre-SMA damage, and some of them are quite odd, but mutism, things like that.